I'd like to begin by introducing the members of our second panel about veteran service organizations. Joe Bosmorowski, who is the Director of Field Services for the Paralyzed Veterans of America. He is a U.S. Army veteran and served in several other positions during his 25 years with PVA, including National Service Officer, Senior Benefits Advocate, and Regional Director. Joe, where are you joining us from today?
Thank you, Ron, and good afternoon, everyone. You may have guessed from my home office decor where I'm joining you from. If not, probably about 10 or 15 minutes right outside of Boston, downtown Boston, where we've had all those championship parades over the last 20 years. I don't think we'll be having one this year, but it's great to be with you all today. Thank you for the invitation, and I surely look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks, Joe. And just for our audience, Joe is not a fair weather fan. He had those Patriots signs up yesterday, even before their exciting come from behind win.
They're always up.
Next, Chuck Bosco is a veteran service officer and appeals specialist at the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs. Chuck is a retired U.S. Army First Sergeant. He served as a medic in Vietnam for 1 year and as a medic in other places for 2 other years, and was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during engagement. Chuck, where are you joining us from today?
Well, like Joe, all of our VSOs are working from home, very limited office time. I live in a suburb of Chicago. As such, when I work for Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs, I work in the regional office for the VA, as that's where the appeals were held and conducted. A little humor I was asking about. When I decided to join the Army, I walked down to a recruiter and said, "Can I join the Army today?" And the guy said, "Sure." And I said, "Can I volunteer to be a medic?" "Absolutely." "Can I volunteer to be airborne?" "Absolutely." Then when I said, "Can I volunteer to go to Vietnam?" the recruiter actually got up, pulled out my chair, had to sit down, said, "Here's a couple of cigarettes, here's a cup of coffee, sign this document before you change your mind." So we had a conversation. I left the office. I believe I heard the recruiter pick up the phone and call one of his friends and said, "You won't believe some idiot kid just walked in here and volunteered for Vietnam." Well, the Army, being as good as it was, actually gave me everything that I wanted. And they did send me to Vietnam eventually, where I was a medic with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. So I'm excited to accept the invitation to participate in this panel today. And I thank LSC.
On the day before Veterans Day, thank you, and Joe, for your service. Our third panelist, Dan Nagin, clinical professor of law and vice dean for experiential and clinical education at Harvard Law School, where he's also the faculty director of the Wilmer Hale Legal Services Center and Veterans Legal Clinic at Harvard. Dan serves on the Judicial Advisory Committee of the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims and is a former legal services attorney. Dan, where are you today?
I too, like Joe, you have a strong New England contingent. I'm about a mile outside of Boston, just I think on the other side of the city from Joe, but in the Boston area.
Well, great. Good to have you all. Thanks for joining us. And Dan, I'd like to have you kind of set the context for our conversation by telling us about what are veterans services organizations, and if you could describe the range of their activities, again, just to sort of put the rest of our discussion into some context.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ron, and thank you to the Legal Services Corporation and to the fellow panelists. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation for this audience. And as Ron said, I'm a former legal services attorney. I worked for 2 LSC-funded organizations when I began my career, so this has a lot of meaning for me. And so thank you all for the invitation to participate. So veteran service organizations, some of you, my panelists are part of VSOs. They are VSOs. Some of you may be very familiar, some of the attendees, with veteran service organizations, but others may be less familiar. So I'm going to try to create a bit of a common denominator. So if this is familiar territory to some, please just indulge for a moment. So veteran service organizations are very, very important organizations that really come in lots of different shapes and sizes and flavors. And that will be one of the sort of points of emphasis of my comments. One thing I just want to say out of the gate, given the setting and the audience, is that any legal services or legal aid organization, any law firm, any organization that hopes to provide pro bono assistance to low-income veterans in need, it's very important to understand the VSO community, to know your local VSOs, and to be engaged, because there are tremendous opportunities for collaboration. So one thing, just to note back to the different kinds of veteran service organizations, so everyone on the call will be familiar with some veteran service organizations. So there are a few very large, well-known organizations that have their roots much earlier in the 20th century. Disabled American Veterans, founded in 1920 and congressionally chartered in 1932. American Legion, the same era. Also Veterans of Foreign Wars. And then there are lots of other veteran service organizations that may not have the same lineage necessarily, but are hugely important just the same. Vietnam Veterans of America, AMVETS, Paralyzed Veterans of America, one of my co-panelists. National Veterans Legal Services Program is actually a veteran service organization that's chartered. Military Officers Association, and on and on. And so some of those are familiar, but these are large organizations that are nonprofits and or congressionally chartered, whose job it is to help and advocate for the veterans community. And that will take lots of different forms. One of the ones that's most relevant for present purposes is that lots of the veteran service organizations have a very robust advocacy program within the VA claim system, where they provide service officers, non-attorney advocates, who represent veterans within the VA claims process, all the way from the beginning, all the way potentially up to the Board of Veterans Appeals. In addition, lots of veteran service organizations also provide other kinds of advocacy for the veterans community, including legislative and regulatory advocacy. Some organizations also provide lots of other forms of social engagement and community building for veterans. DAV, with whom my clinic has a very longstanding and robust partnership, also provides transportation assistance to help veterans access supports through VA and otherwise. So the VSOs are a really, really important part of the veterans community. Many, but not all, of the veteran service organizations are also officially accredited by VA to represent veterans and their survivors within the claims process. And I just wanted to note that, that in order to represent veterans within VA, one must be accredited, with a rare exception, I think, for attorneys who just do a single pro bono case first. I think, if memory serves, one doesn't need to be accredited, but VSOs across the landscape, many of the organizations are themselves accredited, and that then provides the foundation for their service officers to represent veterans within the claims process. I want to mention two other things about VSOs, and then I'll switch gears just a bit and to talk about opportunities for collaboration. One thing is that there are also state and local veterans officers who are part of state or local government, as is true with our colleague Chuck on the panel today. And it's important to understand that many of the veteran service organizations at the county or city or town level or the state level, they are doing very, very similar work advocating for veterans within the claims process and providing other supports. Now, switching gears just very, very briefly, one of the roles that some of the VSOs play, both at the local or state or national level, is to be a source of guidance and advice to help veterans in need, not just with VA claims, but with other kinds of areas where they need support, direction, guidance to be pointed in the right direction. So for example, in some instances, there are many different benefits at the state level regarding tax abatements or certain state benefits. that are very, very important to the veterans community, but where lack of information, lack of ability to navigate systems may make it difficult for veterans to take advantage of those. And so VSOs can also play a very important role there. So because VSOs can be a very important point of contact for veterans, it's important for legal aid, legal services providers to understand what VSOs do, to make sure that local and state VSOs know who they are and they introduce themselves, because you can imagine that for any veteran who's in distress, in crisis, is looking to be pointed in the right direction, who needs help navigating systems, helping your local VSO know what you do, how you do it, how veterans can get connected to you can make an enormous difference. Even if a veteran's going to the to the VSO just to focus, let's say, on a VA claim, it may be in the course of that conversation that other needs arise, and you can be in your local legal aid, legal services, or vet clinic can be a source of help there. So I'll just say a couple things in closing before I pass it on, which is that I think has already been explained very well. Low-income veterans have the same kind of legal needs, unmet civil legal needs, as everybody else, as every other population of low-income communities around family and housing and benefits and consumer. But they also have some very, very specific veterans unmet needs related to discharge upgrades or VA benefits or access to specific veterans programs. And so this is a population where sharing that expertise with your local VSO, what you know, and having them share what they know can make a big difference. And I think if I had to identify one area that could be an important priority, veterans who have less than honorable discharges. Some VSOs help veterans with discharge upgrades, which we'll talk about maybe later. Others, that's less an area of their focus. And it is an enormous gap in legal services. And it's an important role for organizations to play and to be in conversation with the VSO community about how we can help as many veterans who have what's called bad paper as possible, because that's an especially vulnerable population. I'll leave it there, Ron, if that's okay, if that's enough of an introduction.
That's great, Dan. Thank you. And we'll come back to some of those themes. Certainly the theme of the cooperation and collaboration between VSOs and legal aid programs is something we're going to want to come back to. Chuck, what are your main duties and responsibilities as a veteran service officer for the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs? And also talk about, if you would, your training, the training that you and your colleagues get.
My primary responsibility for IDVA, Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs, currently is to be an appeal specialist. With that said, when I'm aware that a veteran is going to have an appointment or a scheduled hearing, we usually receive notice of that within anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. Once I'm notified of that, my duty is to completely review the claim folder and review the issues that are on appeal, and the best possible way to present a brief, for lack of a better description, to present before a veteran law judge from the Board of Veterans Appeals, and to work with the veteran and to suggest things that the veteran may also need to support his contention or her contention that an issue should be either service connected or considered for an increase. The training that I was involved with is 2 levels. One level, of course, is from the Veterans Administration with their particular course designed for VSOs. And everybody that becomes a VSO, regardless of the organization they belong to, is required to attend that training. It could be anywhere from 9 to 12 modules. It's essential, of course, at the end to pass all those modules and to pass the test, which then would be a eligibility for the veterans, the VA Legal Services Council, to issue an accreditation to that particular VSO. All organizations, such as the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs and all the veteran organizations, also have their own internal training. And it's essential that everybody takes that training.
Could you talk a little bit more about the VA claims process, how it works, and in particular about the role and your focus on medical evidence? Why do you need medical evidence, and how do you get it? And particularly if it's not a physical injury, but a mental health service-connected mental health issue? You know, how do you deal with medical evidence in that context?
All claims for disability compensation, I initially will advise the veteran or the claimant that VA disability is much like workman's compensation. Somebody got hurt on the job, whether it be an illness or a disease or an injury that was occurred and sustained while on active duty. And it's really important to designate that even for reservists and National Guards, that injury, if it occurred while they were on active duty for orders, whether it be a weekend assembly or an activation for a deployment, it's important to have that injury or that illness that they're claiming to be included in their service treatment records. National Guard and reservists also have a critical, it's very difficult for them to get service compensation. Usually with the National Guard and Reserve, if an injury occurred on a weekend drill or 2 weeks of annual training, if an injury occurred, it's important to have what is designated as a line of duty statement signed by the company commander or someone in the command structure. Without that line of duty statement, it's very difficult to prove that the injury or the illness occurred while the person was wearing boots, so to speak. With that said, when a claim is submitted, I will sit down with the veteran or their family and suggest that, one, what was the injury and what was the illness? Were they treated for that injury and illness while they were in service? And it's important, sometimes the veterans will have their own medical documentation, their service treatment records, as a copy of them, which they would have to submit with the claim. If they have been separated from the service and they're still receiving any kind of treatment by a private provider, I'll suggest to them to get copies of those medical documentations. It's much easier for the veteran to get medical documentations from a clinic or their provider than it is for the VA to go through and try and get them. It's much quicker and it makes the processing of the claim go a lot smoother. I'll also ask them to perhaps write a journal or a statement indicating what happened to them while they were in service, how did the accident or the illness occur, and what are they still dealing with after service time. Also, statements from the family member, especially a spouse or a partner. Nobody knows the veteran better than the partner. And a statement from that individual articulating what they see the veteran go through or when they became aware of what the veteran has experienced. Many times, spouses and partners know the person while they were on active duty in the service. And usually the person will write letters home saying, I had this problem today. That person will know what they saw when the veteran went into the service, what they incurred during the service, and what they're dealing with when they come out. Those statements are most often invaluable. And so I always sit down with the veteran and the claimant indicating what you need is the nature of the crime, nature of the condition, the records to verify that the injury or the illness occurred while they're in active duty, and statements to add some testimony or a narrative to what they're dealing with and how they experience their problems. And also, if they can, articulate as much as possible. Just don't put a claim in for a certain condition like a back problem. The VA, when they process and develop the claim, they need to know some specifics. What kind of a back problem do you have? What condition, what happened? Because that's essential, because the VA, when they develop the claim, they're going to set up examinations with the VA examiners or outside clinics, partners that they have. And they need to set up an exam for that particular problem to get a medical opinion that, yes, the problem did occur in service, and here's the problem, the current severity of it that the veteran is dealing with. Essentially, that's about it.
Joe, tell us about the Paralyzed Veterans of America, who you represent, unique aspects of your work, and how you go about your work, particularly in working with veterans.
I'll first say, Ron, following you, Dan, and Chuck is no easy task. But secondly, I'll say it's really been such a wonderful pleasure working with Carly and Stephanie and yourself, and getting to know Dan and Chuck a bit. PVA, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, is one of the big 6 VSOs. Dan talked about VSOs, Veteran Service Organizations, and we're one of the big 6, along with some of the others that Dan mentioned. There's similarities with all of us in that we, at least the bigger organizations, we are chartered by Congress. We're accredited by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we're nonprofit organizations. There are no fees for any of the services we provide, representation to any veterans, their families, whatsoever. So although there are similarities, there's also some pretty distinct differences in the expertise that we have. We obviously have expertise in spinal cord injury and disease, which includes paraplegia, quadriplegia, multiple sclerosis, and ALS. Something that we take great pride in is since 2008, when Secretary Peake implemented new regulations that afford benefits in healthcare for veterans with ALS, we've represented about 12,000 veterans with ALS. And that's about 75% of all veterans with ALS in the system. And the reason we have such a high percentage is over the years, the reputation we've developed with respect to representing these individuals, but also our expertise in ALS itself. But also in 2007, before the regulations were finally implemented, we already began outreach to the ALS community outside of the VA. And what I mean by that is private sector hospitals, ALS clinics, so on and so forth. So since 2008, we've helped secure over $1 billion in benefits for these veterans with ALS, mainly in disability compensation and ancillary benefits like the Specially Adapted Housing Grant and the Automobile Grant. We've also represented about 6,000 widows of veterans with ALS, securing over $100 million in benefits. The other big area of expertise for us is VHA, VA healthcare. And I would venture to say that we often have more expertise in VA healthcare than VHA. And I don't say that in a condescending manner. I say that in this sense. If I'm going to a VA hospital or a private sector hospital, for example, because I have heart disease, I want my physician and nurses and healthcare team to have expertise in cardiology, not benefits and statutes and regulations, so on and so forth. And training in healthcare starts with our national service officers, our NSOs, from the time we bring them on board. So it's a critical part of our training, not only initially, but ongoing at our annual continuing education programs, as well as monthly training. We also have representatives, national service officers in VA spinal cord injury centers around the country. There's 25 spinal cord injury centers. We have staff in all of them. And then there are 4 VA medical centers where we have staff. And our NSOs, at least pre-COVID, would meet with patients every day. And they meet with healthcare staff on a regular basis, doctors, nurses, chiefs of services, and hospital leadership to include chiefs of staff, hospital directors, VISN directors, so on and so forth. We're also one of the 4 authors of the independent budget. And the independent budget historically has been a blueprint for Congress in which we all recommend specific funding for healthcare, prosthetics, and a whole host of other benefits. So we have great expertise in VA healthcare, and that's another source of pride for us. Benefits are obviously of critical importance as well. And again, there are distinctions between PVA and other VSOs with respect to our expertise in a benefit that's called special monthly compensation, which is a very complicated level of benefits for veterans who have disabilities that are so severe, they're evaluated at more than 100% disabled. PVA has been known historically for our expertise in special monthly compensation. And in fact, we published a special monthly compensation guide years ago in which the VA actually used as a training tool to help their rating specialists learn special monthly compensation. We represent any veteran who comes to us for assistance. But as I said earlier, our expertise is spinal cord injury and disease, and that makes up about 75% of the people that we represent. The VA defines that category of veterans as catastrophically disabled. So they're the most complex claims in the VA system, which include special monthly compensation. One of the last things that I'll try to cover quickly is I'm still amazed today of all the things that we do as an organization that doesn't just assist veterans with spinal cord injury and disease, but things that assist all veterans as well as the general public. So some of the things that we do that benefit the public as a whole. And you probably can't see, but one of those photos up there is a photo of Gillette Stadium, home of the New England Patriots. And that's opening day in 2002. And as a longtime fan and season ticket holder, I was pretty thrilled in 2001, I believe, to get a private tour of the stadium well before it ever opened. And the reason I was able to do that is because PVA, we have our own medical services department, our own sports department, and our own architecture department. And our architecture department, as well as the local PVA chapter here, New England Paralyzed Veterans of America, worked with the Kraft family, the owner of the Patriots, and were instrumental in the accessible design of that stadium. And that didn't just, when that stadium opened, it was the most accessible football stadium in the country with wheelchair seating and sight lines. And that doesn't just benefit veterans, it benefits any individual who uses a wheelchair, whether it's a child or someone older. But the Kraft family went beyond just accessible seating. And they made accommodations for individuals who have hearing deficits and vision deficits. So these are all things that benefit society as a whole, not just veterans with spinal cord injury. And if I could, I'll try to just give another quick example. We also have the Paralyzed Veterans of America Research and Education Foundation. And since 1976, we've donated almost $52 million in grants and fellowships to entities that are working towards a cure for spinal cord injury and diseases. And I think it was 2007, I was fortunate enough to attend this collaboration we have with the West Haven, Connecticut VA Medical Center and Yale University Neuroscience and Regeneration Center. And viewing that facility was amazing. You walk down a corridor and you see scientists from all over the world in their offices working to find a cure for spinal cord injury and diseases. And the last thing I'll say about that is when viewing their physical therapy rooms and their equipment, one of the things that we found is equipment that was initially built to help individuals with spinal cord injury and diseases. Again, that doesn't just help veterans, it helps society. But the builders of this equipment found that although it might not work as intended for someone with spinal cord injury and diseases, it did help individuals who suffered a stroke and other types of disabilities. So thank you again so much for this opportunity. I appreciate being able to be with you all today. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Joe. That's a very impressive array of services and programs. Dan, let's turn to you. And could you tell us about the Harvard Veterans Law and Disability Benefits Clinic and the work you do at the clinic? And then after you're finished with that, and I know as a lawyer, I shouldn't ask compound questions, but I will, talk about the landscape of law school clinics around the country, because we've heard about a national VSO, which was part of the array that you talked about at the beginning. We've heard about from Chuck about a state wide veteran service organization. And one piece of the service puzzle that's missing are law school clinics. So tell us about Harvard, and then give us a sense as to the rest of the landscape.
Sure. And thank you, Ron. And since we allowed you to ask a compound question, I hope you let the witness flip the order and answer the second question first.
That probably makes more sense. Good idea.
Okay. All right. So just as a bit of background, a law school clinic it's actually a class that's part of the law school curriculum, except instead of being limited to students in a classroom learning concepts, it actually involves real world lawyering. So part of the course is actually helping people and representing people. And there are law school clinics that cover every imaginable topic. There are about 30 to 40, I think at last count, somewhere in there, veterans legal clinics. And they've really grown since the first decade of the 21st century. And in addition to those clinics, there are also a good number of law schools that, even if they may not have a clinic, a formal course that is part of the clinical curriculum, they may have a pro bono project or initiative of some kind. So even if wherever you are in the country, there may not be a quote unquote clinic, there might be an initiative or a project at a local law school that is intended to help veterans in need. Just so folks understand, in terms of the diversity of veterans clinics across legal or law school clinics across the country, they're not limited to one area. Some people hear veterans clinic and they assume, well, that means VA cases. And that's true for a good number of the clinics, that they do handle VA benefit cases on appeal and sometimes up to court. In addition to, service-connected compensation, some clinics do work on GI Bill access or other kinds of VA benefits. But that is just the beginning. Some clinics actually focus on consumer law. Veterans are sometimes targeted by bad actors in the market. In particular, although it happens in lots of different areas, for-profit colleges sometimes target veterans. And so at least one clinic focuses on advocating for veterans who are victims or potentially victims of scams from for-profit colleges. Some clinics focus on housing or family law or employment. Some have partnerships with veterans treatment courts. Some have partnerships with their local VA. Because law school clinics are often part of a larger university setting where there may be other professional schools or graduate departments, such as a medical school or a graduate psychology department, law school clinics are also in a good place if the opportunity arises to partner within their university so that they can bring to bear that kind of health expertise that can be helpful in assessing a case or developing an expert opinion that might be helpful in all kinds of cases. I don't think I mentioned discharge upgrades. I just want to make sure that I do, because that's a very, very important area and a burgeoning area for law school clinics to work in. Turning to the clinic where I teach, I first sort of need to put it in context, which is the Veterans Legal Clinic at Harvard is part of what's called the Legal Services Center of Harvard Law School, which if you were to walk by it, if you were out and about in this COVID-19 era, you wouldn't be in Cambridge where the law school is. It's actually in the city of Boston, and it's a neighborhood legal services program that is actually part of Harvard Law School. And the Veterans Legal Clinic is one of 6 clinics, civil legal aid clinics, all under one unified umbrella that is part of the law school, but also a neighborhood program open to anyone in the community who can seek out our help. And we really run like a legal services program in many respects. The other areas of practice outside the Veterans Clinic, but under the same umbrella, the Legal Services Center, we have a family law, domestic violence clinic, housing, LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic, a consumer clinic, a low-income taxpayer clinic, and then the Veterans Legal Clinic. And I wanted to mention that because we try very much in the Veterans Legal Clinic to connect our clients to these other clinics within our program, and these other clinics connect them to us so that we can provide as much holistic advocacy as possible. Because in the same respect that when someone is ill, they typically don't just have one medical problem, they have a cascade of medical problems. The same is true in the legal context. Oftentimes people who have one legal problem, it has a cascade effect and it can create other legal problems. Someone loses a job or gets sick, that can lead to consumer issues and housing issues and family law issues. A discharge upgrade can have a similar, a bad discharge with bad paper can have a similar kind of cascade effect. And so we'd like to think as much as possible about collaboration around practice areas. The Veterans Legal Clinic, we have 3 different projects. So we don't have a single kind of case. We work across 3 different dockets. We have a Veterans Justice Project where I spend most of my time. We have what's called a safety net project and then an estate planning project, and I'll discuss each of them in turn. In the Veterans Justice Project, we focus on a couple different areas. One is we represent veterans primarily at the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims in appeals challenging VA denial of benefits. We also represent veterans in appeals at the state level because Massachusetts is unique. We have a financial assistance program for low-income veterans and their dependents in Massachusetts that's state and local funded. So it almost operates, for those who are familiar with it, like a VA pension program, except it's at the state level. And we handle appeals both at the agency level and in state court regarding access to our state level veterans benefits. And I'll just do a quick aside at the moment that I think as my colleague Dana Montalto, who's been a trailblazer in this area, has identified that state level advocacy around veterans benefits issues, veterans access, and in particular the rights of veterans with bad paper is a hidden area where there are real opportunities for advocacy. And so our focus on helping veterans, it's not our only focus, but we prioritize veterans who may have been discharged with a less than fully honorable discharge. That doesn't just take place with respect to discharge upgrades, which is one of our major practice areas, or potentially access to VA benefits, but also with access to state level veterans benefits or privileges, because that's a sort of a new frontier in this area. Our safety net project recognizes that veterans in distress may not only have needs vis-a-vis VA, or veteran-specific benefits, but also with the general safety net system. And so our safety net project focuses on challenging denials of Social Security benefits, where there's a lot of overlap between the development that might go on with respect to healthcare history and impairment that's relevant for VA cases is very, very relevant as well to Social Security cases. The Safety Net Project also focuses on access to SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or what used to be called food stamps. It also helps with sealing criminal records to help veterans and others try to have a clean start if they're in reentry mode or they're otherwise trying to obtain employment or other kinds of access. And then last, we have an estate planning project led by my colleague, Destiny Aguero, which focuses on wills, powers of attorney, healthcare proxies for veterans, sometimes also touches on VA fiduciary issues or trust to help someone obtain or maintain eligibility for public benefits or Medicaid. This was a really important practice area. All of our practice areas are important, but it has a heightened meaning in the pandemic because there are a lot of veterans who are isolated, who are older, who have lots of health problems, health risks, who are especially vulnerable to the pandemic. the health side of it, but also the isolation side of it. And so there are also a lot of people who are worried. And do they have their affairs in order? Can they have peace of mind if they get sick about who will make decisions regarding their healthcare choices? And so this is an area where we think we provide a very meaningful service to the community, but in the pandemic, it's taken on heightened importance as more people need points of connection and advice and documents executed for them so that they can try to have peace of mind and protection. Ron, do I have just a minute to touch on the bad paper topic and point out a couple things?
I think it's an important one because we keep hearing it, not just with this panel, but other panels. What difference does it make? And
Sure.
why is it significant?
Yeah, and again, just to make sure that we all have a common denominator, the term bad paper comes from what's known as the DD-214, which is the separation or discharge paperwork that service members are given as they become ex-service members, veterans. It's a piece of paper, and having a less than fully honorable discharge can create enormous problems and barriers for veterans. And it's called bad paper because it's bad to have it. It's bad to have that pejorative information on your discharge because it can cause doors to get slammed in your face in many different domains. Although one of the things I'll mention in a second is that it's also important to demystify a few things about bad paper, which I'll touch on in a moment. So if I had one big takeaway or two big takeaways, one is the importance of thinking about helping veterans who may have challenges related to having bad paper. And the second is to demystify some of the rumors that spread around what doors are or aren't slammed in a veteran's face because of having bad paper. Since 1980, about 7% of veterans have been discharged with less than honorable discharges. And of those, about 81% are other than honorable discharges, or OTHs for short. So that's about 575,000 veterans with OTHs. And having an OTH correlates with higher rates of homelessness, unemployment, criminal justice involvement. It also can create barriers to accessing VA supports and services. And studies show that being closed out of VA supports and services increases risk for suicide. And it's also a source of stigma and shame. And so it's a population of veterans who need a lot of support, but don't always get it. And it can have a spiraling effect as the folks who may have the most intense needs often get some of the least help. What causes bad paper? Lots of different things. No single story and no individual case. We can't just assume that we know what happened because someone has a less than honorable discharge. There are all kinds of explanations. Not every case is a good case for a discharge upgrade. There are lots of different stories to tell. But some common elements that we see in our work and others see in their work is that an unrecognized or undiagnosed post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or other mental health condition can lead to some kind of misconduct or what is perceived as misconduct. Someone could experience military sexual trauma that can lead to problems in their ability to conform or to continue with their prior level of service. Also, certainly discrimination. There's a history of discrimination against LGBTQ veterans or service members. History of race discrimination and unfairness and disparities in separation and application of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So all kinds of things can lead to bad paper, and some of them involve a lot of unfairness. So just because someone has an OTH does not mean they're ineligible for VA benefits. Incredibly important point to make. There are pathways, there are uncertain pathways, and it depends. So no one should assume that because someone has an OTH or other bad paper that the only solution is to go get a discharge upgrade and nothing can happen until you get an upgrade, as if upgrades are handed out. They're not handed out. Those two are complex, difficult cases depending on the facts and the law. But it's really important to know that just because a veteran has an OTH does not mean that they're categorically ineligible for VA benefits. So there are lots of opportunities for advocacy. And one other thing I'll just say is there is a process within VA called the Character of Discharge Determination Process, or COD for short, that provides an avenue potentially for some veterans who have less than honorable discharges to be found eligible for VA benefits, to be found what's called VA honorable for VA purposes. And so even though discharge upgrades are hugely important. It's important to know that it's often a complementary or parallel process and needn't be the first thing that's done before you could help a veteran who has bad paper. There are lots of opportunities to do that kind of advocacy around housing access or state benefits or other areas. I think I will leave it there, Ron, but thanks for giving me that extra moment.
Good. Thank you, Dan. I want to switch gears, and in all of LSC's task forces, probably the single most important word is collaboration. Legal aid can't do it alone. We've got to collaborate with healthcare providers. We've got to collaborate with other social service providers. Today, I want to talk about how veteran service organizations and legal aid organizations can better collaborate to serve veterans' legal needs. Chuck, let's start with you. Talk in your experience, why is it important for, in your work, to collaborate with legal aid organizations, and how have you done it?
I believe that I became in contact with a lot of the legal aid nonprofit organizations at various resource fairs that were conducted and held at Jesse Brown Veterans Administration Hospital in Chicago. And through discussions and conversations I've had with several individuals, these lawyers, these folks would assist veterans with some legal problems. At the same time, they probably felt that the veteran may have had a condition, a medical condition incurred in service that perhaps they should be compensated for. Many times, those veterans do not trust the government agencies. They believe that while they're on active duty, they were neglected or mistreated. And so the faith in the military or any government agency is terrible. So working with the legal aid folks, they can probably refer that individual to a veterans organization, or like us, or like Paralyzed Veterans, American Legion, VFW, to kind of establish a parameter where there's some trust that can be built up between the VSO and the veteran. And then once that trust is solidified and established, then the process of submitting a claim, which probably the person probably needs and is entitled to, can come to fruition. Likewise, when a veteran service officer like myself would realize that the veteran is having some legal issues that I do not have within my parameters to address, I will refer them to a legal aid facility or legal aid contractor. And this way they can get this advice that they need within the law to address those problems, such as eviction notices, or again, bad paper, as Dan was talking about. I'd like to address that bad paper, the less than honorable discharge, is that those laws are so complicated. And I agree with Dan that it takes a lawyer basically to address those issues. And many times the veteran may have an other than honorable, as you go down the list of undesirable or dishonorable discharges, some of them require a lot of work. And going through the Unified Code of Military Justice, that needs a lawyer to interpret and to then provide the best advice for the veteran. We can start the process, but my obligation is to refer them to somebody that I know and I trust, so that veteran can get some assistance. So I believe it's a continuing development with legal aid clinics or social workers to work with veterans and to establish a good camaraderie where we can depend on each other. For example, a lot of the social workers and mental health providers at Jesse Brown feel comfortable enough to walk over to our regional office. In Chicago, the veterans regional office is next door to Jesse Brown VA. And so there's a great communication, and we're just on the same campus. So a lot of doctors or a lot of social workers will bring veterans over to get the help that they need on the benefit side of the house. And likewise, we refer a lot of people over to them saying, if you have a problem, let's walk over there and get you some treatment that you need. So yes, I believe it's important to have a continuing development between all the collaboration of outside agencies and the VSOs.
Joe, could you talk about your experience in collaborating with legal aid programs?
Well, I'll first say I'm probably a bit biased, and I think PVA, we probably have the best attorneys in our general counsel and appeals office. But the bottom line is neither they or we in the field can do everything. Discharge upgrades is obviously one of the biggest issues that we deal with for the reasons that Dan mentioned, and others, but also its effect on state benefits. We have a veteran, for example, with an OTH. He was discharged from the Marines one day short of his 5 years. And he applied for unemployment when he got out of the Marines and was paid unemployment for about a year. And then was hit with a $14,000 overpayment because Massachusetts unemployment laws are complex. And none of us just have, no VSO has the ability to handle everything. Some of the other issues are domestic issues that involve child support payments. We have no authority in state courts. We can't represent veterans in state courts with respect to child care payments, and often issues come up with garnishments and apportionments, which create financial issues for veterans. I myself personally don't have a lot of experience with the lay community, which is why this has been such an awesome experience for me to meet with you all and Dan and Chuck. So there are several issues, sometimes with respect to fraud or even scams out there that, you know, that take advantage of veterans, which often are, you know, our most elderly and most disabled veterans and population. So this is why I, at least myself personally, appreciate this opportunity so much.
I'd like to close our session talking about a topic that's much on all of our minds, which is the pandemic. And all of you faced enormous challenges before the pandemic, and your clients faced enormous challenges before the pandemic, obviously multiplied by the COVID-19 pandemic. Dan, let's start with you. What have you seen in your clinics, but particularly your veterans clinics? You know, how have they been affected, and how have your clients been affected by COVID-19?
Clients can reach out to us to seek help. They could always reach out to us in multiple ways. We have a hotline or intake line. They can reach out by email. We also would get walk-ins just because of our location. Lots of referrals from VA social workers or local VSOs, or information travels very quickly through the veterans community, and often it's a peer-to-peer kind of referral. So we've seen, thankfully, no dramatic change in that people can't find us. We're hoping that they can still find us in a time of need. And we've had hearings that we do telephonically or by Zoom, just because that's how the courts and agencies are shifting, and we're doing as much as that as we can, including students advocating for clients from their homes or different states, being able to participate in Zoom hearings while they're sequestered because the law school is working remotely and teaching remotely. But just to emphasize two things that are notable. One is that back in the fall of last year, before the pandemic, we launched a new web tool to help veterans access state benefits in Massachusetts, called the Massachusetts Veterans Benefit Calculator, which was intended to remove some barriers to information and to help veterans self-assess and prepare essentially their own applications to jumpstart safety net assistance at the state level. And little did we know that the pandemic would make that tool even more important, because veterans and others no longer had the ability to go in so readily and to talk to someone or to get information. So we saw a huge spike in March when things started to shut down. and continued during COVID-19. It's ebbed and flowed some, but it's one of those things we're thinking about online resources, and for civil legal aid programs, thinking about the role of technology is important. And so one other technology tool is we have a suite of iPads that we've gotten that we are loaning out to veterans who are isolated and do not have sufficient technology to engage in quote unquote face-to-face, meaning video conferences, to get legal representation. And so we're working with some VA locations where veterans are getting medical care or in some kind of long-term care, so that we can continue to represent veterans using technology where they may not have things at their fingertips. So we're experimenting with these things, and we're hoping that maybe there are some lessons learned that will carry on, once this pandemic, we hope, is over.
That's a terrific innovation. Chuck, in your client work at the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs, how has it been affected by COVID-19?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Ron, I work at the regional office for the VA. And that building, like a lot of other regional offices, have been closed ever since March. That has proven to be quite a problem, because I don't have the ability to scan documents pertaining to individual veterans or to submit claims. With that said, the VA is moving, the virtual word has kind of taken over. And we have had a lot of Board of Veterans Appeals and local hearings via the internet with virtual hearings or Zoom or Team. VA actually, commencing January 1st, 2021, will get rid of the scan documents to an intake center. And for the Midwest region, it's in Janesville, Wisconsin. There's going to be what they refer to as a direct upload to the Veterans Claim Folder. And I suppose there's some internal mechanism that once a document is loaded into the claim folder, that will trigger an alert for the VA to say what's in that Veterans Claim Folder, whether it be a claim or a document to support a claim. So we're changing. This COVID has forced everybody to get outside of their comfort zones. And I'm not an IT person. I'll be the first to admit it. I'd like to have a black phone with a rotary dial, to be honest with you. But here we are, and we need to learn. I mean, this is what we have to learn to exist with. And for someone like me, it takes a little bit longer. Basically, I should have my grandchildren come over and help me, because they'll probably just dink, 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 and hear you, what's wrong, Papa? But again, we're learning to adapt, and we have to adapt to serve our veterans.
Well, thanks, Chuck. As Groucho Marx once said, any 5-year-old could do this. Somebody get me a 5-year-old.
There you go.
I think both the innovations you're describing and that Dan described are hopefully the kind of innovations that could be helpful even after the pandemic.
Yes.
And so that's could be a small silver lining in all this.
If I may, Ron, I have a follow up on that statement, because the benefit for veterans with the virtual hearings is they don't have to leave the comfort of their home. In the past, they would have to travel to a regional office or another facility where a video conference would be conducted. And the judge, of course, would be in Washington, and the veteran would be either with me in the regional office or another facility. Now they can be in their home. So, and the hearings can be scheduled a lot quicker, because they're not dependent on space available at the regional offices. So there is a benefit, and I believe that's going to be beneficial for everybody down the road.
Thanks, Joe. How has PVA's work been affected by the pandemic?
Notwithstanding the challenges of COVID-19, we've actually probably communicated more with the clients we represent than pre-COVID-19. Our national office has had probably 3 or 4 Zoom membership meetings over the last several months. And with respect to us in the field, we've initiated several projects, for example, to contact all our widows, just solely for the purpose to check on them and see how they're doing in this challenging environment. So many of them are older and they're alone and they can't get out. And also routine checks on our members. So I think we've probably contacted about 15,000
Wow.
people just through that alone. But also Zoom. Some of the hospital issues are more difficult because we can't be in visiting patients, not only for our own safety, but for the safety of patients themselves and VA staff. But we do have some of our staff, NSOs, who've participated in the non-clinical part of VA telehealth. So they might be participating with the section that the social worker is involved in. So ironically, there's been major challenges, especially early on in March, when we all had to adjust to this new way of operating. But especially over the last several months, I think we've done pretty well with taking care of the individuals we represent with their disability claims, their health care, and just checking on them, see how they're doing and make sure they're all right.
So again, a development that may have legs, as it were. We have one follow-up question. This is for Dan. Maybe a hopeful point. Dan, do you have a sense as to how many of your students go on to represent veterans after they've worked with you?
I couldn't tell you by percentage necessarily, but I'll share you some anecdotal evidence. Our students go on to all different kinds of careers. Some go into government service, some begin with clerkships, and then they may end up, somewhere where they're still figuring out their path. Others are going to big law firms. Some are going into business or academia, and some are going into public interest law. One of the things that we always love to see are students who land, let's say, at a big law firm, and they say, I'd like to spearhead an effort for my firm to do some veterans work. And can you point us in the right direction? And we might point them to the consortium if that firm doesn't already have a relationship there. And so we hope that we're helping to light that fire. And we love to hear, which we do often, from students who are thinking about the work they did in the clinic and trying to carry it forward into what their pro bono practice might be at a firm. And even here in Boston, where we have a good number of our students who end up working locally, we've had some very, very nice relationships we've forged with their firms to refer cases of all kinds, discharge upgrades, and sometimes even state benefit cases. And so that provides an opportunity. And then we do have some students who go on to a public interest career focused on veterans. One of our former interns just began last month as an Equal Justice Works Fellow in our clinic. And so she was a former student intern in the Veterans Legal Clinic, and now she has funding for a 2-year fellowship focused on vulnerable veterans and thinking about estate planning and eligibility for various safety net programs. And there are a couple of other examples, but we always love to see those. And whether it's from private practice or government or public interest world, let the students carry that torch forward in some way. It was always wonderful to see.
Well, I can't think of a better note to close on. I want to thank Joe and Chuck and Dan for being here today, but more importantly for the work all of you do and your organizations do on behalf of veterans every day. Thank you. Stay well. Thank you all.